What a Saturday. College football last week, a reminder of what makes the sport so much fun. We had upsets galore, including two of the top four teams in the country going down, both from the SEC, both falling to unranked teams. Vandy's win over Bama, its first ever against a top five team, and they beat number one. The Big Ten saw two of its highly ranked teams go down as well, with Michigan and USC both getting knocked off. And we are happy to be joined now by Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt. Joel, what a wild week in college football last week. 5 of the top 11 teams in the country got knocked off. I want to ask you about the two Big Ten games that involved top 10 teams losing. And you had the rematch of the national championship game from last year. And I realize Michigan isn't quite what they were a season ago, and Washington is a very different team as well. But what does the Huskies win tell us about each one of those programs and where they are right now?
Well, let's start with Washington. I think it tells us that Jedd Fisch is just a really good football coach, and obviously they lost a lot, as you kind of alluded to in the question, from what they were last season. And they're coming back and getting better every single week. And this is what Jedd does. This is why he was able to build a really competitive winner at Arizona. And I trust that he's going to do the same at Washington. That's number one. Number two, that's a really difficult place to play. And I think all of these teams from the traditional Big Ten, they're going to go out to kind of the new Big Ten, if you will, on the West Coast. They're going to start to see these venues for the first time, Autzen Stadium, Husky Stadium, and start to realize, like, oh, this is easily one of the tougher places to play in the entire conference, and I think that we saw that. So that would be my second point. And then thirdly, when it comes to Michigan right now is playing really poor football, in particular in the fourth quarter, and that's not something that we were used to seeing over the last 3 seasons. When I turn on the film, I see poor decisions being made. I see structures that are not sound on the defensive side, in particular when they're blitzing. Whether they're missed assignments or just what those structures are, it kind of remains to be seen. And then they're not doing the little things in the fundamentals of the game that we saw them do a year ago, like route depth. One of the interceptions late, I thought Colston Loveland drifted down the field. That's not something that we saw last year. And so this Michigan team has a lot of things to correct, because I think they found their identity with Jack Tuttle. I think that they looked like Michigan for the first time this season, and yet those same mistakes crept up, and the fourth quarter went all the Huskies' way. And you look up now, I think that they've given up, Rev, I want to say like 63 points in the fourth quarter this year. They only gave up like 45 points in the fourth quarter all year last year. So something's going on right now with Michigan, and they need to get it corrected fast.
I'm with you. It's overly simplistic to just focus on the quarterback. As you said, the quarterback play, obviously there were a couple big mistakes by Jack Tuttle giving the ball away, but the quarterback play is only the tip of the iceberg. And to your point, the defense, it really is a challenge. Let's focus on USC losing at Minnesota as well. And USC, of course, had already lost to Michigan. So now 2 losses. There was so much excitement about the Trojans coming out of week 1 and that win against LSU. Now they got Penn State at home this week. What do you make of where the Trojans are, and specifically that loss to the Gophers?
Yeah, they're another one of these teams, kind of like Michigan, that they're not equipped to make up for big mistakes, okay? So only the best teams in the country can just make mistakes and still win football games. You've got to do the things necessary to win, and turning the football over is not one of those things. USC now has 2 turnovers against Michigan, 3 against Wisconsin, and now 3 against Minnesota. That cannot continue, because let's face it, and they would even be the first ones to tell you this, they're still trying to develop with a young offensive line. So this is not a team that's going to be, I think, a team that's going to just explode offensively week in and week out and make up for turnovers like they were able to late against Wisconsin. Now you face a team in Minnesota that we saw get much better in their loss in the second half against Michigan. I think you would agree with that. Like, we saw them find their identity. Darius Taylor, that run-oriented PJ Fleck program that we've been used to seeing over the last couple of years. We saw that start to manifest in the second half against Michigan. They lose. Now they come back and they played really hard in a really solid game against USC, and they get the 3 turnovers. USC is ill-equipped to make up for those mistakes. And now you go face a Penn State team, and Rev, this is not a great matchup for USC. Penn State runs the ball really well. They rush the quarterback really well. Those are two areas that USC has struggled with to this point.
That's what I was going to ask you a little bit about. It does feel like a line of scrimmage mismatch to me. Penn State feels like they are significantly better on both lines of scrimmage than USC is. You saw Penn State last week. You guys had them on Big Noon against UCLA. And there's so much excitement about Oregon and Ohio State, and we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, it's a 2-3 game in your league, which is pretty remarkable. But number 4 is Penn State. So it feels like a little bit of that is getting lost in all the hype surrounding those other two. And again, justifiable hype. But you saw them in person. Like, how legit is Penn State as a national championship type team?
I think this week has a lot to do with what I think about them in terms of their prospects on the national title stage. Because if they are, Rev, a national title contender, they would go take care of business this week because of that mismatch on the offensive and defensive line. I think you would agree with me on that. They would go out there and assert their dominance in the areas where there is dominance to be asserted. And right now, I look at this Penn State team. They have taken care of business everywhere except for the big matchups over the last couple of years. This is the next step. If they can go win a big game on the road against a USC team, it tells me that they're ready for the prime time. I love their run game. I think Katron Allen is terrific. He's consistent. Nick Singleton was precautionary, held out last week. I think he's going to be just fine this week, so he's back with that explosive run game. They've got Abdul Carter on the edge, denied Dennis Sutton on the edge defensively to rush the quarterback. And I think Drew Aller looks more comfortable and more confident than he has in his entire career as their quarterback. You throw on top of that Tyler Warren is becoming one of the most versatile weapons in college football. And this is a really good college football team. Now, whether they can take that to the top stage, I think this weekend will tell us a lot about what James Franklin has in terms of what it could be moving forward. And by the way, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Let's say Penn State wins this week. Let's say Ohio State wins this weekend, both favored. Let's say they both win next week. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Depends on what happens with Texas over the next couple of weeks, that Penn State, Ohio State play as number 1, number 2 in the country in Happy Valley on November 2nd.
Yeah, that is going to be a huge game, no matter how you slice it. But to your point, it could become maybe the biggest game of the season in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
The biggest game in the season in the Big Ten to this point is Ohio State and Oregon playing on Saturday in Eugene. You know, early on this year, we talked a lot about Oregon and what was going on with the offensive line, and did they run the ball well enough? Could they stop the run?
Yeah.
The challenges they had against Ash and Jenny and Boise State. It feels like they've cleaned a lot of that up. I mean, I look at these two teams. I don't see an obvious, discernible weakness with either one. Would you agree? And what do you think this one comes down to?
It's a good question. I mean, I do not see a weakness for Ohio State. I think I see more just like maybe a subtle question. How will Will Howard play in a huge situation with this amount of pressure? That's a question I have about Ohio State, but certainly not a weakness that I see in them. I can't say the same about Oregon because there are things that I see as not only questions but clear weaknesses. Turning the football over 3 times inside the red zone from a veteran quarterback, that's a weakness. You know, Dylan Gabriel's got to clean that up. Giving up 195 yards to Ashton Jeanty at home on the ground, that's a weakness. The fact that they gave up so many sacks over the first couple of weeks, that's a weakness. So as they've shown in some spots during the season that's not exactly who they are, that's at least in their bag. You know, it's like a golfer. It's like you have a duck hook in there. It's like it's in there somewhere. So for Oregon, there's a couple of duck hooks in there for Oregon that we haven't seen with Ohio State. So I think on paper, Ohio State's one of the best, if not the best team in the country. Oregon has shown us that they have a very high ceiling and candidly a pretty low floor. And where they play remains to be seen. This is, I think, the biggest question about this weekend is how well prepared is Oregon? How well do they play at home? Is this going to be like an Alabama-Georgia type environment where Alabama jumps out to a big lead? Or are we going to see these things creep in? For instance, Ohio State is going to run the football. You know, like Rev, they ran it for over 200 yards and 5 a carry against Iowa. Guess what never happens against Iowa? That, like ever. It happens like 3 times in the last 4 seasons. And Ohio State you look across and you see that Ashton Ginty ran for 195 yards, you're going to test that, and they will.
He may win the Heisman Trophy, but I get what you're saying, right? I mean, it does show a vulnerability there.
But I mean, Travion and Quinshon are nothing to scoff at.
Agreed.
You know, I mean,
100%.
like, let's
no, 100%. Yes. Yes.
And by the way, like, I don't know about the group of 5 winning the Heisman Trophy. Let me just say this. He better run for more yards than Melvin Gordon ran for, because Melvin Gordon ran for 2,500 yards, did not win the Heisman Trophy, and that was at Wisconsin in the Big Ten. Mariota won the Heisman Trophy. He better run for more yards than Barry Sanders ran for, because Barry did it in 11 games. Ashton's going to, have 12 or 13 games. So there are bars that he's going to have to reach, or else it's just like the schedule's not going to be difficult enough for him to win that, at least in my estimation. But people have called me a big conference snob, and I'll wear it proudly.
Well, I've called you a heck of a broadcaster, and I'll tell you what, I've got the duck hook in my bag. I've got the slice. I've got all of it. But I know that you and Gus and Jenny will hit it right down the middle of the fairway on Big Noon.
You take the analogy. You talk about broadcasting 101 right there.
I did what I could.
That was beautiful.
Arizona,
was beautiful.
Arizona, BYU. Enjoy yourself in Provo, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Joel.
You got it, bud. See ya.